Coalition's virtual town hall on step therapy. I'm Gene Ransom. I'm the CEO of MedChi, which is the Maryland State Medical Society, and I'm going to be your moderator today. The reason I suspect I was selected to moderate this important issue was because Maryland is one of the states that's actually passed some rules around step therapy to protect patients. In Maryland, we have a law that just took effect in July of 2014 that says that an insurance company cannot use a drug that is not allowed by the FDA for that use in a step therapy protocol, and if a drug has been working for a patient, they're grandfathered in Maryland. Protections like those are really important for patients, and the incredible panel that we put together today is going to explain why this is such an important issue for patients and what it means for patients when they're subjected to these step therapy or fail first provisions that make their lives and their medical treatment very complex and very difficult. I want to get started by having Mark Guman from the Arthritis Foundation, who's worked many years on patient access issues, give us a little overview of his experience and knowledge of step therapy and how it really does affect patients. Mark has got a long history of government affairs work and really is an expert in the issue. So I'll turn it over to Mark now to talk a little bit about it, and then I'll introduce our panel after Mark gives us an overview of step therapy.
Great, thank you. First off, step therapy is used by insurers to control costs. It's a tool or a protocol used to limit how much insurers spend covering patients' medications. Under step therapy, a patient must try one or more drugs chosen by the insurer, usually based on financial, not medical considerations, before coverage is granted for the drug prescribed by that patient's healthcare provider. In step therapy, patients must take drugs selected by the insurer, not the doctor. Patients may be required to try one or more alternative prescription drugs that are of lower cost to the insurer, but may not be in the best interest of the patients. Sometimes these substitutions include over-the-counter medications, which shifts 100% of the cost burden to the patient. Step therapy use is increasing steadily. In 2010, nearly 60% of all commercial insurers were using step therapy. As of 2013, 75% of large employers reported offering employee plans that utilize step therapy. And step therapy is applied to many diseases. Step therapy is applied to drugs treating a wide range of diseases and chronic conditions, including, but not limited to, Alzheimer's, arthritis, autoimmune diseases, cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, glaucoma, hemophilia, HIV/AIDS, and mental health. So why should we be concerned or care? Insurers claim that step therapy helps to lower healthcare costs while maintaining or possibly improving quality. In some cases, step therapy has played a role in achieving these outcomes, but in other situations, data clearly shows that step therapy can have the opposite impact. Step therapy, in fact, can delay or lower healthcare quality. Since step therapy requires patients to try one or several medications before being covered for the drugs selected by their healthcare provider, it can delay access to the best therapy. In the course of these delays, patients may experience disease progression, which is a serious risk for anybody living with a debilitating or life-threatening illness. Step therapy can also prevent patients from receiving treatment at all. Studies have shown this in 1 in 5 patients. Step therapy can also lead to increases in cost. In a study comparing spending on schizophrenia medications in Georgia's Medicaid program, step therapy saved the state $19.62 per member per month. However, these savings were accompanied by a $31.59 per member per month increase in expenditures for outpatient services. As a result, step therapy did not have the intended effect of reducing overall costs. Rather, it increased healthcare costs. Similar findings have been observed when step therapy was applied to blood pressure medications and others. We hope this was a helpful introduction to step therapy. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That was terrific. Mark is joined by an incredible panel of patient advocates and experts from the healthcare community. And what I'm going to do is introduce our panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to the first one who's going to talk about this important issue. So today on the panel we have Dr. Brood, Dr. Stevens, Andrew Sperling, Mary Liana Lee, and Patrick Stone. Dr. Brood is the owner of Dermatology Associates of Lancaster in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and is a clinical professor in dermatology at the University of Pennsylvania. He deals with this issue in his practice every day. Dr. Stevens is affiliated with Mill Peninsula Medical Group, Mills Peninsula Physician Network, and Sutter Mill Medical Network, and is a board-certified clinical rheumatologist in private practice for over 23 years. And he deals, his clinical interests are dealing and focused mostly in autoimmune diseases and disorders. Andrew Sperling directs NAMI's legislative actions before Congress and before federal agencies. Since 1994, he serves as the co-chair of the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities Housing Task Force, a coalition of national disability advocates and provider organizations dedicated to promoting policies and funding to increase access to affordable housing opportunities for non-elderly adults with severe disabilities. Mary Liana Lee is the Senior Director of State Government Affairs at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, LLS, and in that role, she oversees all their state policies, working to engage state lawmakers and regulators in improving access to care for people living with blood cancer. And step therapy does affect the patients that she's representing all over the country. And last but not least, Patrick Stone is the Government Relations Manager for the National Psoriasis Foundation. Prior to joining NPF, Patrick worked as a state government relations consulting firm and aide in the Maryland General Assembly in beautiful Annapolis, Maryland. So we'll start off, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Brood to talk a little bit what step therapy means to a practicing physician. Dr. Brood, take it away.
Thanks, Gene. Thanks for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to be here at this town hall meeting. So my name is Bruce Broad. I'm a dermatologist. I'm a board-certified dermatologist, board-certified pediatric dermatologist, and I direct a clinic at UPenn in Philadelphia that specializes in treating patients, some of the patients with the most severe forms of dermatitis. So these are patients that whose lives are debilitated by chronic itch and chronic skin disease. I spend most of my time seeing patients, general medical and surgical dermatology, who have disabling conditions of the skin, like psoriasis, severe acne, and skin cancer. I feel like I'm practicing in the best of times predominantly, but sometimes also the worst of times. I mean, we're truly living in an age of miracles in terms of the medications that we have for our patients that we didn't have over 20 years ago when I started practicing. And I realize it's one of our responsibilities as physicians, as healthcare providers, is to be cost conscious when selecting a treatment. But I can't tell you how frustrating, and I think that's an understatement, it is for me and for our patients when we have to jump through excessive hoops to get our patients what we know, based on our experience and training, are the most effective medicines to treat their conditions. So, you know, in the early days when I started practicing, my biggest headache in terms of step therapy from the insurance companies was getting my choice of antihistamine approved by the insurance company. So dermatology, we deal with skin conditions. We have itchy patients. So sometimes we use antihistamines like Benadryl, which is over the counter, and Zyrtec to control itch and to control hives. Now, at one point, they were prescription. So if a patient had hives years ago, I wanted to prescribe Zyrtec when it was a prescription drug, when it was the newest drug. The insurer would tell me the patient has to have failed other antihistamines like Benadryl and Atarax, except we didn't like to use those first line because they caused a lot of daytime drowsiness. So it actually got to the point I became so frustrated one week that I started writing on a prescription pad for patients to take to the pharmacy. I'll see if I can hold this up. Antihistamine du jour, just to make a point, because the prescription that I wrote was typically never covered, so I never knew what was going to get approved by the pharmacist. So I changed the name of this prescription pad that I have to a suggestion pad. And I'd like to reverse those times. So picture this scenario. This is sort of a true story, but it's a common story also. So I had a 10-year-old child with psoriasis. Psoriasis involved his face and his genital region. And for those of you who don't know what that might look like, I don't know if this projects, but I'll show, these are pictures of psoriasis in a child. You can see widespread redness and scaling all over the skin. Here's another picture. It involves, if I can get it on the screen, the nails, the hands, and just a horrific condition. So you can imagine a child with this. Kids have enough problems just growing up in a normal existence. The embarrassment. So that, you know, the child goes to school, his face is red and scaly. The child goes to the swim club, wants to change into his bathing suit and has to hide around the corner because he has psoriasis, all the genital skin. So they finally get to me, the dermatologist. Their pediatrician has been trying to treat them with various cortisone creams. And imagine the disappointment when we find out that some of the topical medications that I want to prescribe beyond what's already been tried that I think will be effective for this child aren't covered by the insurance company. So for instance, sometimes we'll use something called tacrolimus ointment. Sometimes we'll use vitamin D analogs but they're not covered. Why? Because the patient hasn't gone through the arbitrary step therapy laid out by the insurance company. So this was a real instance. I saw this patient recently. His step therapy requirements required him to have failed a stronger topical cortisone cream and also a cream that contains coal tar. Now, two problems with that. And so essentially the insurance company is making a decision on his medical treatment. The problem is we don't like to use strong cortisone creams on the face or genital area because they cause tremendous side effects, thinning of the skin and other rashes. The other thing, if you can picture, is imagine if we have to have this child use coal tar, that's sort of a black salve ointment, to his face and genital area first before we can prescribe more effective and safe, elegant medications. How is that going to be perceived by his peers? It's going to stain his clothing, and it doesn't work as well. So basically, by the time we finally got this kid to the medications that I wanted to use first line, it was 3 visits later, and he had a more prolonged period of suffering from his skin disease. I think psoriasis is probably the best model in talking about step therapy and how it impacts dermatology patients. It's one of the more common and one of the more severe skin diseases that we treat as medical dermatologists. Patients with psoriasis not only suffer from their skin disease, but they're depressed. They lose time from work, and it's a systemic disease. Not only does it affect their skin, it affects their joints. The costs are tremendous. So psoriasis, not only, I'm not talking about the cost of treatments, but the indirect costs of treating psoriasis are amazing. These patients lose time from work. They have medical appointments that they have to keep, and it's a real disability. In a recent study that came out in January, the yearly indirect costs, so not the cost of therapy, but the societal costs, ranged from $24 billion, that's billion with a B, to over $35 billion. Now, when I first started practicing dermatology, there were more limited treatments for psoriasis, and these are effective treatments. Light therapy, phototherapy, we use topical therapies, and for patients with more widespread psoriasis, we use stronger oral medications like methotrexate and cyclosporin. But today, there are new medications, there are biologic drugs, and even some oral drugs that are amazingly effective and that have advantages over some of these other therapies. But unfortunately, our use of them is limited by step therapy. So while dermatologists are comfortable using the sort of the old drugs like cyclosporin and methotrexate, the reason we have these newer drugs is because those drugs weren't as effective, although we still use them, and they have significant serious side effects, toxicity to the organs, the liver, the kidney, and the bone marrow, and they require a lot of monitoring. I'll show you some pictures of adults. This is from a textbook, so I don't think it's an issue in terms of HIPAA, but I don't know if the audience hopefully can see. But this is what severe psoriasis looks like. Widespread, thick, scaly, painful plaques all over the body. These are some pictures here that you can see where it affects the nails. It affects the palms, where we depend so much on our hands and the soles of the feet. There's no single best drug for psoriasis, but with the advent of the biologics, it's been one of the greatest advances in my professional career. Many of these drugs, many of the biologic drugs, and the predominant class are TNF inhibitors, have been on the market and approved by the FDA for well over a decade. So these drugs are being impeded, as well as some of the other biologics, by step therapy. And I think the point I want to make is it's not like these are newfangled drugs. It's not the latest craze of drugs. These are drugs that have been accepted standard therapy in patients with psoriasis for over a decade. I would estimate that over half the patients that I see that are candidates for these biologic drugs, which really help control their psoriasis, have to go through step therapy, which means they have to fail treatments that I, as the specialist in dermatology, don't think will necessarily be the best to treat their psoriasis. The most common drug that patients have to fail first is methotrexate. And while it is a drug that we're comfortable using, methotrexate has 12 black box warnings on it. Now I sort of printed this off this morning. So this is 2 pages regarding methotrexate of black box warnings for the drug. What's a black box warning? It's the most severe warning issued by the FDA. 2 of the black box warnings that I want to point out, one is fetal toxicity and the other is hepatic toxicity. So fetal toxicity means the drug causes birth defects. Hepatic toxicity means it can cause cirrhosis of the liver. So I'll give one example. Imagine, and this has come up innumerable times, that a young woman presents to the office in her early 30s with psoriasis all over her body, debilitating to her basic existence. And you have to break the news, I do, that her insurance company requires her first to take methotrexate for her psoriasis, and then, if this doesn't work, she can be then prescribed a biologic. So basically, her choice is to delay, if this is something that she has planned in her life, childbearing, to go on the methotrexate because that's what the step therapy requires, or live with her disease rather than go on a drug that's been around for a while, one of the biologics, that has a higher safety profile and have clear skin for life. Another common scenario is a middle-aged man comes, he has psoriasis all over his body, it's on his hands, he works with his hands, he can't work, but his condition is complicated because he has a mild form of alcohol dependency. Alcohol, of course, is toxic to the liver. But step therapy would require him to go on methotrexate first, another liver toxic drug, so that basically he's being asked, and we're being asked to first put him on a drug and risk liver toxicity and cirrhosis before going on a biologic, which would clearly be a much better choice for him.
And that's exactly the point, Dr. Bird, that the insurance company is making us make these choices where we have to just do what an insurance company bureaucrat wants and not what the physician and the patient need. I just want to quickly remind people if they want to ask questions, they can click that link on their screen and the Q&A will pop up and we'll ask that. And I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I want to keep moving so the other folks get a chance to present, and we'll come back to you with some questions. Those were great examples of how insurance companies are really getting in between that physician-patient relationship, and they're making it difficult for folks to get what they need to get care. And you gave several examples related to drugs and biologics, but it's not just dermatology. It's actually not just drugs. This is done with procedures and even testing sometimes. These step therapy or fail first protocols. So let's hear from Dr. Stevens now and hear a little bit about how step therapy is affecting his practice as a rheumatologist. Dr. Stevens, you want to give us a little overview?
Well, of course. Good morning from the West Coast here, California. I am a rheumatologist, certified in rheumatology for quite a while, and indeed what we've talked about already is pretty clear that step therapy makes it difficult for all physicians across the board in all disciplines to actually ensure that our patients are getting the therapies that we feel are most appropriate for that individual patient. And indeed, the process of going through step therapy, which is one of just several formulary restrictions, makes the application of that therapy also a delayed process. And as was pointed out just a little bit earlier, delaying therapy in some of these patients can have rather long-lasting consequences. Some perhaps more subtle effects from the physician's standpoint include the fact that this process, and whether it's one of several formulary restrictions, step therapy, prior authorizations, multi-tiered therapies, policies, all of these undermine our relationship with our patients. We work with the patients, they come to seek our opinion, and we try and get them the best therapies we can based upon who the individual patient is. And telling a patient they have a diagnosis and telling them that they need to wait for someone in an insurance company to decide what medicine they can begin is rather frustrating for us. In addition, because these are not the medicines that we perhaps feel are best for our patients, and all medicines have potential side effects, then indeed we also carry the risk of what those side effects will be to our patient on drugs that we did not actually recommend. So there are elements of frustration, and we feel exasperated in trying to get our patients the very best care. In that light, we also try to advocate for our patients, and that means applying for an appeal that we don't agree with the medicines that are being put forth by the insurer. Appeal processes take time. So now we're caught in that endless sort of weeks to months duration of trying to appeal a process. If the appeal is denied, which very often does happen, then indeed you can ask for a peer-to-peer discussion, which once again now puts you out even further in applying treatment for a patient with what can be a rather serious condition. I have a rather small practice, and I have to dedicate my staff to helping me with dealing with these problems. If you have a larger practice, then indeed you might even be in the position that you need to hire additional staff to take care of this. That brings us to the question of how does this impact our office staff? And I mentioned the great frustration for all of us. It's not just doctors and patients, it's the staff, even pharmacists are frustrated by the great deal of paperwork and procedures that need to be done to comply with some of the insurance policies. Step therapy is just one of several, as I've mentioned. But the staff also, in my case, spends over, I think we have over 98% of our patients who are covered by commercial payers who indeed have to adhere to some sort of formulary restriction. And that means that my manager, actually, we checked recently, is spending 40 to 50% of her weekly time dealing with authorization requests and then going through the appeal process when we try to advocate for our patients' care. It's a tremendous burden. I have one example I was going to bring up of just showing you how frustrating this can be. Going back to 2012, when United Healthcare came up with a formulary that they decided first-line biologic therapies should be Humira and Enbrel, and this is in the care of rheumatoid arthritis patients. 1 year later, despite the fact that patients on these medicines like Humira might have been doing very well and successful in their therapy, they changed and removed Humira from their list, forcing us then to tell patients who had been on successful therapy that they had to stop and change to something else that was carried by their insurance company. To make matters worse, 2 years later, at the beginning of this year, Humira was added back to the formulary. It was there with other medicines, and they took off Enbrel, which had been on the formulary for 10 years. So patients who had been on 10 years of successful therapy then had to change and go on to something else to comply with their insurer. So this whole rigmarole is very not only unhealthy for patients, but very frustrating and work heavy for our staff in our office.
Dr. Stevens, before we switch to some of the patient groups, we have a question from the audience. You mentioned how often you mentioned the frequency of appeals and how often they're accepted, and the audience wants to know how much time is your staff spending on them, and how often are these appeals accepted by the insurance company when you go through the process?
Well, I don't know that I can give you an exact percentage of what's accepted. Generally, appeals, for the most part, I can tell you are not accepted. The staff spends somewhere between 16 to 20 hours a week working with either the original authorization request or then again dealing with appeal processes.
Yeah, and we've heard from two physicians and how it's affecting the practice of medicine and these rules that insurance companies are putting in place, these fail first or step therapy policies that are preventing it. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk to some of the folks that represent the patients that are affected, and that's really maybe who matters the most. And why don't we start with Andrew, and maybe you can talk a little bit from your perspective, Andrew, on how this is affecting the members that you represent.
I'd be happy to. Again, my name is Andrew Sperling, and I work at NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We're the nation's largest organization representing and advocating on behalf of people living with severe and persistent mental illness and their families, disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. These are very serious conditions that have enormous public health burden associated with them. We have good treatments, for example, for schizophrenia, but they're far from perfect. We don't have a disease-modifying breakthrough medication available. The tools we have now, the clinical tools, in particular atypical antipsychotic medications, they're effective at helping patients control their symptoms and function at a higher level, but they're likely to live with the disorder this serious for the rest of their lives and take these medications over a long period of time. As again I mentioned, they can be very helpful, but they have severe side effects associated with them. Each of these medications, and I can give you some examples of them. There's Abilify, there's Risperdal, there's Zyprexa, a large number of them that are available. Each of them has a different mechanism of action in the brain, and each of them has a different side effect profile, and each of them have a very different label as approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And so what we know is they're not interchangeable. And the reason we know this is we actually had a government-funded study called CATIE, C-A-T-I-E, which was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, and they compared a number of these atypical antipsychotic medications with one of the older ones. And what they used for efficacy was, as a proxy for efficacy, was the switch rate, the rate at which patients needed to switch this medication for whatever reason, if it wasn't working for them, if they had an episode of psychosis or other type of problem. These were tested in patients. The subjects in this study all had schizophrenia. And what we found at the end of the trial was that 69% of the subjects enrolled in that trial had to switch a medication at least once, and 50%, half, had to switch at least twice. So this led to the conclusion that NAMI took away from this study, and that is these drugs simply aren't clinically interchangeable the way some other therapeutic classes might be. So when we talk about step therapy, it's very dangerous in this particular therapeutic class of medications. What we know is that step therapy is based on a presumption of clinical failure. You have to fail on one compound before you can get access to a different compound. Well, that failure is very serious for patients living with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and other serious mental illnesses, because once you have an acute episode, because the treatment that that the insurance company preferred, that insisted you try first, fails, you actually oftentimes never rebound back to that level that you were at. We also know that these medications take a long time to take effect, and you often, when you're switching, you have to titrate down one medication and titrate up the other, and that can be a process that can take as long as 5 or 6 or 7 weeks. So randomly switching people and requiring step therapy is very dangerous with this particular therapeutic class. And on an individual basis, I can tell you, I meet patients every day working at NAMI where they have to go through these processes of step therapy, and I would add that it's disproportionately there in the Medicaid program. And many states use step therapy aggressively in their Medicaid program, and that is of concern to NAMI, because these are often the sickest patients. They're on public benefits and they're on the Medicaid program, and we shouldn't be using or imposing step therapy as a means of closing a gap in the governor's budget, because this is very dangerous for their ongoing therapy, and NAMI believes it's deleterious toward their health. So NAMI feels strongly that we need to work on policies at the state level, and we heard what was done in Maryland and some other states. This has been done as well, to place some constraints and parameters around step therapy to make sure that it doesn't hinder the progress that patients make and impact negatively on the quality of care that people get, particularly in a program like Medicaid, where we're dealing with the most vulnerable in our society. So with that, let me stop.
Yeah, I think your point on Medicaid is a really good one. And the other issue is those Medicaid patients are in the worst position to fight and appeal one of these decisions. And if they aren't lucky enough to have a good doctor like the two we have on this panel, it's really hard for them to get that situation overturned.
That's absolutely correct. In some cases, in public sector psychiatry, you have some community psychiatrists at a community mental health center. They are literally only have 8 to 10 minutes with a patient once a month to review their medications and review what's working and what's not. And it's very, very difficult in that circumstance to launch the appeal, to go through the bureaucracy that the insurance plan puts in place to keep patients from getting access to the medication that works best for them on an individual basis.
And NAMI in Maryland was very active when we worked in the legislature to pass the legislation. They were one of the key partners, and they advocate on all kinds of issues like this, fighting for patients. One of the other organizations that was key in Maryland being successful in passing step therapy, that worked very closely with MedChi, was the Maryland Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And Ms. Lee, who is the Senior Director of Government Affairs, oversees all the states, so she's working all over the country trying to figure out how to pass protections like this. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about how these step therapy or fail first protocols affect the patients that she represents.
Thanks, Gene. As many of you probably know, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is a patient advocacy organization. We are committed to finding the cures and ensuring access to care for patients who are living with a blood cancer diagnosis. We're very proud and humbled to serve as the co-chair for the SAME Coalition, or the State Access to Innovative Medicines Coalition. We call it the SAME Coalition for short. As I said, we serve as the co-chair for that group, and the SAME Coalition, as the host for this event today, I want to take just a real quick second to say thank you to everyone who has joined us. We're so pleased to have so many of you watching out in the ether. The SAME Coalition fundamentally is a collaboration. It's a collaboration between patient groups, provider groups, friends from the life sciences fields, organizations who together share a concern about patients having access to the care that really is represented by these hugely exciting innovations that have begun coming to market, especially with great rapidity in the last 5, 10, 15 years. We all are staying abreast of the trends in the design of health insurance plans, and we're concerned that those designs are really putting in place barriers like step therapy that, though they may have well-intended goals, can have those unintended consequences of causing harm to patients under certain circumstances. And so the same coalition got together last year. We've been together for about a year now. It's our birthday this summer. We've really thought of ourselves as a brain trust for the communities of stakeholders who are concerned about this issue. We think of ourselves as the brain trust, providing those well thought out model legislation, pieces of those leave behinds to bring to legislators. We're really wanting to drive the dialogue around this issue and see that policy change is in fact realized around the particular protections that we think would decrease the likelihood that something like step therapy could result in harms to patients, as we've talked about. Now, I briefly mentioned model legislation. That is one of the things that I think myself and all of my colleagues on the same coalition are so proud of in our first year together. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Patrick with the National Psoriasis Foundation, who's also a member of the same coalition. I'm going to ask Patrick to jump in here and share with you guys our perspective on that model bill that we put together, just a quick rundown of the components in it and our rationale for having included those.
Thanks, Mary Elena, and thanks to our host today for putting this together, and hello to everybody for out there on the internet, and thanks for logging on. My name is Patrick Stone. I'm the State Government Relations Manager for the National Psoriasis Foundation. The National Psoriasis Foundation advocates for the 7.5 million Americans that are affected by psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. To dial down into this legislation we've worked on through the same coalition, to give you a little bit of a background, I think the approach was that there's been several pieces of legislation in either Maryland, Vermont, Connecticut that have introduced regarding step therapy, and each of those bills are different. Legislators have an appetite for seeing what other states have done, seeing their success, and repeating that. And so model language is key to giving them that piece of legislation that they can say, this is what New York did, or this is what Maryland did. It was successful. Here's a bill. It's the same. It'll work for your state as well. With that intention, the legislation it has three components to it. The first component is the clinical review criteria aspect of the legislation. What we're saying here is that step therapy protocols should be based on clinical evidence that is brought together by a group of individuals, a panel of individuals that are independent from the insurance companies. We're not trying to ban step therapy in any ways. We just believe that it should be based on pure clinical evidence from an independent panel. That's the first step to this process. The second step, and I had to say that the two doctors that gave a presentation really got me fired up about the amount of time that it takes away from their staff and away from themselves to treat patients in order to get through the process that the insurance companies have laid out. The second part of this bill addresses that component, which is that there should be a clear exception process to step therapy. I won't dial into reading the legislation, but there are several points that we provide that will provide a clear exception process. If you've taken a medication before, on a previous plan or under your current plan, that would be an exception to the step therapy protocol. If the drug is contraindicated or would have an adverse effect, as methotrexate or was pointed out could have an adverse effect on, say, a woman of childbearing age, that would be a clear exception that's outlined in the legislation. And if you're stable, I think this is a really important part of the legislation. If you are stable on medication, whether it be through your current plan or previous, and the formularies change, which they do quite frequently, you should be allowed to continue that medication and stay stable on your medication so that, well, I think it's important to point out with biologics and some of the emerging technology that it's really important to take this medication on a continuous basis or you lose the efficacy of the medication. So that's a clear point there that we're pushing for. And then the transparency aspect of the bill. If an insurance company is going to have step therapy protocols, they should be transparent about it. They should be on their website, and if they have an exception process, that should be on their website and easily accessible to the patient or the provider. I think oftentimes, and I know the doctors on the town hall today would agree, is that oftentimes finding out this information, what the exception process looks like, who they need to speak with, is a very arduous process. We would like that to be a lot more clear. And then I think the second part that Mary Elena wanted me to go through was to give it some highlights of some legislation that we're working on currently within the states and what people can do. And I know Mary Elena will talk briefly after I'm done speaking about the calls to action and how advocates or potential advocates that are on the line can take action, but I'll highlight a few key states. In New York, we had a really good week last week. We had a lobby day in New York where we had a press conference regarding the legislation in New York. The fight in New York has been going on for a number of years, and I believe we made some significant progress thanks to some wonderful advocates on the ground there in New York. However, the bills, which are in the Assembly and in the Senate, are still stuck in their respective committees of origin. If you live in New York and you would like to write a letter to your legislator, or you're interested in getting involved and sharing your step therapy story, please do reach out to your organization that sent you this information, or myself, or anybody else that's on this panel. The session is winding down in New York, but it's a 2-year session, and we really have an opportunity, I believe, next year during the legislative session to get that bill passed. I think one of the greatest opportunities we have currently is in California, Assembly Bill 374, which is the step therapy bill, which is sponsored by the Arthritis Foundation. Mark Gaimond and his group have done a wonderful job out in California, along with, in conjunction with NPF, LLS, and other members of the same coalition, to get that legislation to move forward. We had a lobby day there about a month and a half ago, where we had nearly 60 advocates from different organizations on the ground talking to legislators about this issue. As a result, as a direct result, I hope, of that day, that bill has passed out of the Assembly and is moving towards the Senate. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We've got a great opportunity to pass that bill in California. Illinois, not as much of an opportunity there at this point, but next year we still do have an opportunity. We had legislation in Illinois. We again had a lobby day. We had patients testify from the NPF on the step therapy legislation and how it impacts their day-to-day life. Unfortunately, that bill is not going to pass this year. We're going to address it next year, but we're looking for more patient stories and looking to build a stronger coalition in Illinois on the ground. North Carolina is still in session. It is a budget year in North Carolina, but we still have a bill there that is hopefully going to move forward in some fashion. If you're interested in joining our coalition, please do reach out to me. It's a wonderful coalition, and we've got some great leadership behind our bill in North Carolina. I could go on and on for probably about an hour.
Can you give us a website? Can you give us a website or something people can go to, or a place where they can go to if they want to get involved in your coalition or see the model bill, or what's the best way for them to get a hold of you so they can get involved?
So you can go to the National Psoriasis Foundation's website, and under our advocacy tab, you can find our contact information. There's a form that you can click on to take action. It'll send you your information to me. You can also follow us on Twitter at @NPF. We'll have a tweet that'll go out right after this town hall that will provide an opportunity for you to take action. So look for us in all avenues of social media. I'll hand it back over to Mary Elena.
Yeah, I'll jump in there to talk for just a couple of seconds about this question of how can you make a difference. And I think from Patrick's remarks, those of you who are listening, you've probably begun to put together a bit of the how you can make a difference, right? As far as the same coalition is concerned, it's really just a simple matter of getting your organization involved, getting your constituents involved, whether those are patients, their providers, whether it's folks from the life sciences communities, whether it's caregivers. For all of us, there's an opportunity to help influence this issue by reaching out to our legislators, in particular at the state level where these bills are so active, to share with them our concerns. If policy isn't your strong suit, no worries, it will be the strong suit for a partner of, who's going to be sitting next to you at a bill hearing or in another, in a visit with a legislator. Everybody has a role to play, and so, on that, I want to say, sure, meet with your legislators, but don't feel intimidated or overwhelmed by that prospect. Just sharing your stories, something, an act as simple as that can really make a difference, because it plants a seed around. It plants a seed with policymakers. It gives them that sense of urgency, so that they know that there are real-life human impacts connected to this issue. So, again, reach out to your legislators, share your concerns with them, share your stories with them, help the patients and other caregivers in your lives to put their stories down on paper, to practice their elevator speeches, and to reach out to their own legislators as well. Patrick mentioned for you a couple of states where there has been legislation active this year. I fully anticipate, from where I sit at LLS and with the Sin Coalition, that there will be many other states in the spring that will see legislation bouncing around on this topic. So don't feel as though the only states where there are chances to engage are just the ones that Patrick mentioned. There will be many, many others. I think it goes without saying that for really any of the organizations, any of the patient organizations that you heard from today, we all have information posted about these and other patient access issues on our websites. We all have, information up there, places where you can enter in your number, your email address if you want to get in touch with our advocacy teams. So know that NAMI, MPF, LLS, AF, we have open doors, and we're ready to be resources for you, both in terms of knowing the policy, reading the model language, learning about the model language, and then also on the action side in terms of knowing how to share your story, how to craft your story, things of that nature. So, turn back over to you now.
We have lots of folks online and lots of questions that are getting backed up. So I'm going to try to get, with the little bit of time we have left, I'm going to try to get through some of these questions from audience folks. And the first one we have here is the importance, asking the physicians, and Dr. Brood or Dr. Stevens, you can decide who wants to take this one. But they'd like one of you to expand on the importance of having the right medication and how much it really matters. Who wants to tackle that?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically the bottom line is patients come to us as physicians because they're suffering. They want to get better, and really the crux is to getting them on the right treatment, the safest treatment and the most effective therapy. And so one of the huge frustrating things about step therapy is it really forces us to prescribe medications that are just suboptimal for the patient at that time. So either it's a medication that we're concerned isn't going to be very effective, and that translates into the fact that the patient is still going to live with their disease, their condition, whatever that is. In my case, it's skin diseases. We saw the pictures of severe psoriasis. We see the debilitating effects. And the other issue is safety. So we're trying to also steer patients into treatments in today's world that are not only the most effective, so that they get better and can return to a normal functioning life, but also so they can sort of get to a safe landing as well. And I'll let Dr. Sperling add his thoughts as well.
Did you want to add anything?
Hugely important.
No? Okay. We have another question here. We have a question for Andrew, actually. When you were speaking, Andrew, you gave an example of step therapy requiring an off-label use for a medication, and the thought was, or the question was, could you expand on that? Interestingly, the Maryland law that was passed bans that procedure. The requirement of an off-label or a non-FDA use in a step therapy protocol is banned under the Maryland law. And frankly, I personally think it's pretty offensive that something that a pharmaceutical company would end up getting in a lot of trouble if they were selling something for that they're not allowed to do, but the drug company can do it. But Andrew, let's hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a complex issue because there are, for example, in the case of bipolar disorder, there aren't a lot of on-label indications for many of these medications. Bipolar disorder is a very complex condition with mania and depression and even psychosis. And so some of the prescribing that's done for serious mental illness is often done off-label, but just because it's off-label doesn't mean it's not clinically sound, because we have clinical treatment guidelines published by specialty societies that often entail off-label prescribing. So it's not always a bad idea, but in many cases it is going to be very dangerous, and quite frankly that probably is a patient safety issue in terms of in many cases banning a step therapy requirement with an off-label use, and it can be quite dangerous, but we want to make sure that clinicians are following sound, peer-reviewed, scientifically evidence-based treatment guidelines. And I know that some of the other physicians there, in the case of dermatology or rheumatology, might be able to illuminate that more in terms of making sure it's not just the label, but that the step therapy being, to the extent that it happens, we want to make sure that it's aligned with evidence-based practice guidelines developed by specialist societies and based on sound research.
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
so
I'll take it a step further. This is a true story, but I've had patients stepped upon. That's sort of what I tend to call it. Where the insurance company is actually requiring that they step first onto a suboptimal dose of the medication. So, okay, physician and patient, you can have your first choice medication that you think will be most effective. But you have to first try a lower dose. Of course, that translates into a lower cost. So you can use the biologic drug that you think will be most effective for the patient's psoriasis, but you have to start out using a suboptimal dose. Some of the drugs that we prescribe, of course, are dosed based on the patient's weight. Larger people require more drugs. Smaller people will have a therapeutic effect on a lower dose of the drug. And I've seen policy that states that the patient has to first be tried on a dose lower than the optimal dose, and then if they fail that, which of course they ultimately will, then and only then, after several doses, and this can be a lag time of 6 months, can you actually prescribe the appropriate dose indicated based on clinical trials for their weight. So decisions are being made by people who don't deal with these diseases that influence how we treat the patient.
So we've talked a lot about the financial impact on the insurance company and them trying to save money by putting these procedures in place, and the financial impact on society, where it's actually costing us more money. But one of our audience members wants to know about the financial impact on the patient, and I wondered if, Mark, you wanted to comment on these policies. Do they have a negative impact on the patient's financial health, from one of our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about is people taking we're looking at step therapy, but it's also called a fail first policy or fail first protocol. You're asking somebody to take a medication and fail on it, so they're paying for something that is not in their best interest. And of course, that could be out-of-pocket co-insurance, that could be hitting their deductible, but there's other financial implications to that too. And I'll speak specifically to arthritis. You may have somebody who's been diagnosed previously or continually with arthritis. If the medication they're not receiving at that time is inappropriate, they may be unable to work. They may require some kind of care. So it may not be a direct out-of-pocket cost from them. It can be an out-of-pocket loss to them or to their family or caregivers or other. So I think the larger question in terms of financial losses is yes, absolutely. Fail first causes people to buy something that they don't need, and that could be 2 months, 6 months, whatever that period of time is. They're not getting the medications they need, but they have to pay for them anyway.
I can also add to that a little bit, in that the patients who are on these therapies that were not first decided upon between the physician and patient, but rather promoted by the insurer, sometimes will not only be ineffective, but will cause the patient to lose, and I think what Mark was saying, indirect costs, work time, not to mention the impact on the family. If you're in pain all the time, your relationship with your family members are going to be affected rather severely as well. And so we do see some costs that are difficult and not easily quantitated that is affecting the patients tremendously in a lot of these cases.
Okay, we have another question from the audience, and it is there federal legislation, or is this really a state-by-state issue? And I will say that traditionally insurance issues have been handled and regulated at the state level, but I will let Ms. Lee fill us in on the rest of that as one of our lobbying experts here.
That's right, Jean, and I would say at this point the greatest opportunities for really achieving some policy wins on this issue are at the state level. You heard Patrick outline a number of bills that have already been put in motion, and the same coalition as I described is hoping to play a larger and larger role in that. And I will put in just a little plug here for the concept of a model bill. Part of the reason why we came together as a group, right, why we saw this need for a brain trust is because we wanted to ensure that as this issue was gaining traction out in various states, that we wanted to ensure that the outcome wouldn't be this patchwork of different bills, different degrees of protection, different types of protection. We wanted to do our part to ensure that there would be some consistency so that patients across the nation would have access to the same degree of high-quality protection when it comes to their insurance coverage and utilization management in their insurance coverage. So yes, it is at this point largely an issue that's bouncing around at the state level, but you know, I think organizations like those who are represented here today are doing their best to ensure that the outcomes are consistent across the board.
If I could add, very briefly, there is a potential federal angle here, and that is some of the Obama administration did put out something called the Notice of Benefit and Payment Parameters, which is a fancy term for saying how they're going to scrutinize the plans that bid to compete on the federal exchange as part of the Affordable Care Act. And the good news there is they're starting to hint that they're going to be engaging in greater scrutiny of plans that aggressively use step therapy and high cost sharing and tiering of medications that limit access. And they have a very robust tool on the Affordable Care Act with a non-discrimination standard, and we're waiting for a rule soon from the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services. They will hope will provide greater scrutiny when plans disproportionately use not just the fourth tier of a medication, but step therapy, placing it on the highest tier, and even specialty tier, where they engage in co-insurance, not co-pays, where the beneficiary is left paying 30, 40, 50% of the entire cost of the medication. That severely limits access, and we're very concerned about it.
And to that point, I think it's really important, before a lot of these laws take place, that we encourage patients to check and see what they're getting with their insurance, see if their doctor's in the network, see if they use fail first or step therapy protocols or require prior authorization. Ask those questions when you're on the exchange. Ask those questions of your human resources department. Ask those questions during open enrollment. That's really important. I'm going to try to get one more question in from the audience, and that is talking about how successful in the states where this legislation has passed has it been. And I wanted to give a plug for us. In Maryland, we have had specific examples of patients who have used the grandfather clause successfully. And our statute says that if you've been using the drug for 180 within the last 180 days successfully, the insurer cannot make you go through a step therapy or fail first protocol. And that works even if you switch insurance companies, which happens often. And it has made a difference. If you're interested in learning more about the Maryland law, you can go to www.medchi.org. And we have a really good one-pager on step therapy up in our patient resource section. And I don't know if Patrick or one of you want to comment on some of the other states that have passed legislation with regards to that question.
Sure. I think it's honestly we're waiting on that data. Given that the legislation has passed recently in a couple of states, I think it's going to be a little bit of time before we get that very accurate data. I think we're starting to hear whispers from the states that have passed legislation about the effectiveness. Specifically, and I think this is important to mention, that it has not driven up costs, that they cannot point to this legislation as driving up costs. I think it's embarrassing, frankly, on the opposition side when they throw numbers at the wall at $50 million in increase in costs and just really data that is not, or numbers that are not supported by accurate data. And I look forward to being able to present that data as we have been able to on other access issues like our out-of-pocket cost cap effort, to be able to show that this will not have an impact on premiums in a negative way, and that it will actually affect premiums in a positive way, because as we all know, patients that are treated properly and that are taking the medication that is best for them drive down costs. It's a simple matter-of-fact statement.
Well, it sounds like we could talk about this for another hour or two, or maybe more, but we've hit the magic hour and our time is up. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your time. This was an incredibly informative group of people and a great panel, and I really appreciate every one of you participating, and thank you so much to our hosts. Have a great afternoon, and let's get working on reforming step therapy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.